Today we're going to be evaluating functions. So to start with, let's look at a function that is an equation. I have f of x. Remember, I can read this by saying f of x. The parentheses do not mean multiplication. Remember what each of those letters represents. The f represents the name of my function. The x, it represents my input. This part over here, 3x plus 4, represents my rule. So in this case, what my rule is saying is take your input x, times it by 3, and then add 4. So if I take my rule and my input, this entire thing, f of x, results in my output. Let's look at a few examples to describe this. So f of 3. What it's saying is, look at my function f, which I see over here. It says to input, because that's what goes inside the parentheses, input a 3 into my rule. So I'm going to insert 3 in for x. That's going to result in 3 times 3 plus 4, which outputs 9 plus 4 is 13. Let's try that again. If I input a 0, I'm going to have 0 times 3 is 0 plus 4 gives me an output of 4. Take a second and pause the video and try the next two on your own. All right, last two. If I input a -2, -2 times 3 is -6, plus 4 is -2. And if I input a -9, -9 times 3 is -27, plus 4 is -23. What does f of x equal 25 mean in words? This means, if I plug 7 into my rule, I get out 25. When my input is 7, my output is 25. Now, if I'm not looking at just one function, notice I have 3 options right here. Remember to pronounce this, I would say f of n, g of b, and h of x. So when you hear me say those phrases in math, that's how mathematicians would pronounce those things. All right. So when you look at a problem, the very first thing you do is identify what function we are looking at. So they named this function g. So automatically I'm going to look at function g before I input anything. I'm going to input a 2 into my function, and my input variable is a b. So I'm in my rule, I'm going to input 2 into b. So 12 minus 3 times 2. Let's do the math really quick. 12 minus 6, and that equals 6. So my final answer would be g of 2 is equal to 6. All right, second problem. F of 7. Well, this time I'm going to be looking at my f function. So 2n plus 7. I'm going to input 7 into my input variable. So 2 times 7 plus 7. 2 times 7 is 14, and 14 plus 7 is equal to 21. So I can say that f of 7 is equal to, I already wrote the equal sign, is equal to 21. Now I included this next example, g of -3, to make sure that everyone's careful with their negatives. So 12 minus 3 parentheses -3. Remember, I'm plugging it into the function g. Now, because I have a negative times a negative, that means I'm changing that to an addition problem. So 12 plus 9 is 21. So g of -3 is equal to 21. Now, in my last example, I'm going to look at function h. And if I come over here, I notice in my rule, that I have 2 x's. All that means is I'm going to input 3 into both of those input spots. So here I go. 3 squared plus 3. And what is 3 squared? That's 9. Plus 3 is 12. So h of 3 is equal to 12. If I'm looking at a table, so here's the table that I'm going to ask you to write into your notes. So if I have this table, I want to first determine what I have. Notice in my first column I have x. So what they gave me is the list of 3 different inputs for my function, 1, 2, and 3. They're telling me to look at function f. So I'm going to look at this function for this table. And my input is for this first line is 1. So in order to fill out this first box, I'm going to insert a 1 into my function. So taking out the x and inputting a 1. Negative 2 times 1 is negative 2, plus 3 is 1. And I'm going to do that for each of my values. 2, inputted 2. Negative 2 times 2 is negative 4. Negative 4 plus 3 is negative 1. Take a moment, pause the video, and answer the last box. Alright, if I insert 3 in for x, that means I'm going to have negative 2 times 3, which is negative 6, plus 3 is negative 3. Now if I look at this other table, I can see that the top of the column says h of x. So this time, I'm going to use my h function. I'm going to input a 7. 7 plus 3 is 10. The next one I'm going to input an 8. 8 plus 3 is 11. And the last row, I'm going to input a 9. 9 plus 3 is 12. Now notice on these next 2 examples that my tables have flopped. This time I am given the output values and asked to find the inputs. How is that going to work? Well, remember that f of x represents my output. So f of x right here is representing my output. So if I know my output is 3, that means I'm going to replace f of x with 3. So let's write down here what our equation would look like. 3 is equal to negative 2x plus 3. And I'm going to solve this equation to find my input. Minus 3 gives me 0 is equal to negative 2x divided by negative 2 results in 0. X equals 0. So in my first row, when my input is 0, I know that my output is 3. All right. Second output is a 7. So 7 goes where my output would go, equals my rule, and that will tell me, if I solve it, what my input is. So minus 3 from both sides. 4 is equal to negative 2x divided by negative 2. X is equal to negative 2. Last but not least, 11 is my last output, equals my rule, and solve. Minus 3, 8, equals negative 2x, divided by negative 2, and x equals negative 4. And that is how I fill in the inputs for my table. Now, just as a check, remember on this other table that my output is now based on the function h. So this is my rule for function h. My output is 7. So 7 is equal to 3x minus 2 is going to tell me what my input is. Plus 2. 7 plus 2 is 9 equals 3x divided by 3, and x is equal to 3. I'm going to pause there and I'm going to ask you to fill out the rest of your table. it should be 5 and 7. Last kind of problem. Our first step is to interpret the sentence. If g of b equals 21, what is b? Well, what is this even asking us? Well, remember, g of b represents the output. And remember that since b is inside those parentheses, b represents the input. So let's reread this with those two words. If the output equals 21, what is the input? Notice that this is the same question as this. They're giving me my output and expecting me to find my input. So what does that mean I'm going to do? If my output is 21, I'm going to take out g of b and replace it with 21 and equals my rule. And that should let me solve. So minus 12, 9 is equal to negative 3b divided by negative 3. b is equal to negative 3. So I just determined that if my input is negative 3, my output will be 21. Last example. To practice this one more time. So remember, this means output. Inside the parentheses was an n, so this means my input. So if f of n is equal to 25, so if my output equals 25, what is my input? Well, my output is 25 equals my rule for f, 2n plus 7, and solve. 25 minus 7 is 18 equals 2n divided by 2 gives me a grand total of 9. If you have any questions, please reach out to your teacher and go ahead and start your assignment on Canvas.